Thank you, Shinar. I had the pleasure and also the challenge of being here 10 years ago at the very first Freedom of Expression conference. When we were here then, we visited prisons. We visited the writers in prisons, the publishers in prisons. We visited the courtrooms. At an interesting time, Shinar and others had quite a unique idea to publish a book called Freedom of Thought. And in that book, they republished articles of writers that had been brought up on charges in Turkey under the various laws. And then they engaged hundreds, if not 1,000, artists, publishers, academics, to sign on as publishers of this book. And then they came to Penn and said, would you members around the world sign on as publishers of this book? And many of us did. And then the Turkish government was faced with a challenge, because do they prosecute all of us? And they brought charges. We protested, and the government said back to us, well, the international people who signed on will not be charged unless they are in Turkey. So Shinar, being the quite original and confrontive person that he is, said, come to Turkey. And so many of us came to Turkey as the, quote, publishers of this book, Freedom of Thought. But in quiet voices said, you know, we really don't want to go to prison in Turkey. And Shinar said, don't worry, you won't. But we want to confront the government with its laws, to show the consequence of these laws. And some of the great writers, including Yasha Kemal, had charges brought against him. So the very idea of confronting the state with its own laws and the consequence of that laws was the beginning of this gathering, as I understand it, and it was the beginning of many of us coming to Turkey to stand in solidarity with our colleagues. It was a very different time, I think. I know we were followed as we went to the prisons. We were concerned that the phones were tapped. It was a much heavier security presence at that time. So I'm very glad to be back and to see the changes that have occurred in Turkey in the last 10 years. I remember at that time, particularly the young people. I remember the brother of a promising writer who was then in prison, and the pain that brought his family. I also remember the students, the student guides that took us around. I remember the young policemen, because when we went to the university, I don't think it was this, when we went to the university to have a conference similar to this, the square was filled with students which were surrounded by riot police, so we never got inside the doors. Instead, we held a bullhorn and addressed the students from outside with riot police surrounding us. And I remember the faces both of the young students and of the police, and how sad it was to see the young of a country confront each other. And we knew from afar in Diyarbakir, where there was conflict going on, we knew the young soldiers. And so what touched me was what this did to the young and the new generation coming up. Because a generation, the young people don't agree with each other any more than the mothers and the fathers and the grandparents. But to have them confronting each other across riot gear and at the other end of guns was not the way that's productive for a country. So I'm very glad not to be seeing that here, though I'm sure there are still soldiers and there are still police, but the atmosphere has changed. We do not have the numbers of writers and publishers still in prison only for their writing that we had 10 years ago. There are, however, still threats against writers, not only from the legal system, but also from the society. And as we know, this conference is dedicated to one of them, Hrant Dink, the Armenian writer and editor who was shot this year and killed. In the last decade, we have seen this progress in Turkey because an amnesty released the writers and publishers from prison, and some of the most oppressive legislation was rescinded. But we've seen this progress checked because other legislation has taken its place. And even if we don't have the same number of writers and publishers in prison, we have large number of writers and publishers entangled in the court system with charges brought against them. This last year, as Sarah explained, International PEN has launched a global campaign against defamation and insult laws. And as Sarah explained in Europe, we can also look globally. At least 1/4 of PEN's cases relate to insult and defamation laws around the world. But the prosecution of these laws and the penalty for these laws does vary. In Turkey, Article 301, which charges writers for insulting Turkey, has entangled many of the writers here in this country. Frequently, these charges have been dropped by the judiciary, but it still entangles the writers in the process of the legislation and in both the time and the cost of such legislation. Over the years, I think there's no country that PEN has been more engaged with than Turkey. Now, there are many places in the globe where the consequences to writers are much more severe. In China, in Burma, Cuba, and Iran, the consequences are much more severe to writers. But there are few democracies, if any, where there are more writers entangled in laws that curb freedom of expression than Turkey. So perhaps we are here the most because we have the most hope for Turkey. Or perhaps it is just because PEN members love Turkey. We love the great literature of the Turkish writers, the culture of East meeting West we see here, and the possibility that Turkey offers to the world, and particularly to its region, for championing freedom of expression and an open society. And perhaps also because here we meet such courageous writers and publishers and organizers, such as Shinar and everyone who works in this field. When we were here 10 years ago, the Lawyers Association also hosted us, and the lawyers who work for these writers and publishers who are in prison and often work for free. So it is the colleagues here that also inspire many members around the world. And only those within a society really can change a society, but the rest of us come here in solidarity for the Turkish writers and publishers and authors and lawyers and students and everyone who sees the importance of a free and open society. As many of you probably know, PEN itself was founded in 1921, right after World War I, and it was founded with the idea that literature should not know any borders and that writers should be able to talk to each other across politics and national borders. And the hope was that if ideas could flow freely, the nationalism that had causes and had caused wars could at least reduce. And so very quickly, PEN spread throughout Europe, then through the Americas and Asia and Latin America, and the writers around the world come together with that hope, that at least by communicating with each other and holding up this ideal of freedom of expression and a free society, we can have some influence in the world. And I think we have seen some of that influence here in Turkey. The role of the writer and the publisher at this time seems particularly important in Turkey. Ironically, if the writer were less valued, perhaps the writer would be less attacked and threatened. But the power of the word, in fact the power of many words from many points of view, challenges authoritarianism and absolutism and fundamentalism and those who would want to see only a single culture. In his last published article, the day that he was assassinated, Hrant Dink wrote, "My computer hard drive is full of messages from citizens of this circle of rage and threats. To what extent are these threats real, and to what extent unreal? In fact, it is impossible for me to know. What is the real threat, and what is unbearable for me, is the psychological torture. I am like a dove. Like a dove, my eyes dart everywhere, in front of me, at the back, to the left, and to the right. The effect of Article 301 should not be exaggerated. Just look at the price. This is the price. Do you know, ministers, what a price it is to imprison someone into becoming as nervous as a dove? Of course, Hrant Dink's words still resound. But we should remember that doves also fly. And we must hope that the ideas from this conference and from Hrant Dink might fly into the office of those ministers and into the provinces, in the cities, in Turkey, and in the region and beyond. Thank you.